When the Mexican military finally caught up with El Mencho in the mountains of Tapalpa, Jalisco, in February of 2026, the entire world assumed the CJNG, the most dangerous cartel on the planet, was about to collapse. Governments celebrated. Analysts predicted internal wars, fragmentation, chaos. But within weeks, U.S. counterterrorism officials confirmed something nobody saw coming. The man who quietly stepped into the throne of Mexico's most violent criminal empire wasn't born in Jalisco. He wasn't born in Michoacan. He wasn't even born in Mexico. He was born in Santa Ana, California, Orange County, about 10 minutes away from Disneyland. An American citizen, born September 12, 1984, in a U.S. hospital, raised in a U.S. barrio, who went to school in the same state that produced Silicon Valley and Hollywood, is now the leader of a cartel that the United States government officially designates as a foreign terrorist organization. Think about how insane that actually is. The DEA, the FBI, Homeland Security, they spend billions of dollars every year trying to keep cartel influence out of America. And meanwhile, the man now commanding an army of tens of thousands of sicarios, controlling drug routes across 6 continents, is one of their own citizens. A kid who grew up watching American cartoons, in an American suburb, who today has a $5 million bounty on his head from the very country that issued his birth certificate. His name is Juan Carlos Valencia Gonzalez, but in the underworld, they call him El Pelón. And I assure you, the real story here isn't the headlines you've seen this month about sanctions and org charts. The real story lies in the 2 decades this man spent in the shadows, the secret military units he built, the private army trained by Colombian ex-soldiers, and one operation so audacious, so borderline suicidal, that it should have gotten him killed 100 times over. Because this man once kidnapped the sons of El Chapo Guzman, the most famous drug lord in human history, held them hostage, stared down the wrath of the entire Sinaloa cartel, and walked away breathing. One move, one kidnapping that cemented his legend forever and set him on the path to inheriting an empire at just 41 years old. But before we get into how a Cali-born kid ended up running the CJNG, I need you to first understand something. El Pelón didn't claw his way into the cartel world from the outside. He didn't start as some corner dealer who worked his way up. This man was born into narco royalty on both sides of his family tree. And once you understand his bloodline, you'll understand why his rise was almost inevitable. Let's go back to the beginning. September 12, 1984. Santa Ana, California. To understand how a future cartel kingpin ends up being born in Orange County of all places, you have to understand his mother's journey. First, her name is Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia. She crossed into the United States undocumented when she was just 14 years old. A teenager from Michoacan with nothing to her name, working brutal hours in the agricultural fields of California, picking produce under the sun like hundreds of thousands of other migrant workers. On paper, her story looked like every other immigrant story of that era. Hard work, low pay, a young woman trying to build something from nothing in a country that barely acknowledged her existence. But here's the thing, Rosalinda wasn't just any migrant field worker. She belonged to the Gonzalez Valencia clan, and if that name doesn't mean anything to you yet, let me put it in context. The Gonzalez Valencia family would go on to become Los Queenies, an organization that U.S. Treasury officials would later describe as one of the most powerful money laundering machines in the entire drug trade. Los Queenies weren't the guys with guns. They were the guys with accountants. The financial arm that took billions in dirty cartel money and washed it clean through businesses, real estate, and shell companies stretched across the globe, from Mexico to South America to Europe and beyond. While other cartel families were flexing gold-plated AK-47s, the Gonzalez Valencias were quietly building the infrastructure that made the entire enterprise possible. Because cocaine doesn't mean anything if you can't spend the money it generates. So that's the mother's side. Now listen closely, because the father's side is arguably even heavier. Juan Carlos's biological father was a man named Armando Valencia Cornelio, And if you know your cartel history, you know exactly who that is. Armando Valencia Cornelio was the founder of the Milenio Cartel. The Milenio Cartel doesn't exist anymore, which is why younger audiences might not recognize the name. But in its prime, this organization was a monster. Operating out of Michoacán and Jalisco, the Milenio Cartel was one of the dominant trafficking organizations of its era, moving massive quantities of cocaine and methamphetamine north into the United States. And here's the detail that brings everything full circle. When the Milenio Cartel eventually splintered and collapsed years later, its fragments and its people became the raw material that would eventually form the CJNG. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel literally rose from the ashes of the organization that El Pelón's biological father founded. So do the math here. On his mother's side, the financial masterminds who launder the money. On his father's side, the founder of the cartel whose remnants became the CJNG. This kid, born in an American hospital in Santa Ana, was carrying two of the most
Un grupo de hombres y mujeres busca cuerpos en un tubo en donde los Zetas arrojaban los cadáveres.
Powerful bloodlines in Mexican organized crime before he could even walk. But amidst all of this, the most important relationship in his life hadn't even formed yet. Because according to accounts of the family's history, and I have to say unofficially, because this part of the story lives in the gray zone between intelligence reports and narco folklore. When Juan Carlos was only about 2 years old, his mother Rosalinda met a man in California, a man from Aguililla, Michoacán, a former police officer turned trafficker who had done time in American prisons for heroin dealing, a man who at the time was a nobody in the grand scheme of the drug world. His name was Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes. The world would come to know him as El Mencho. Let that sink in for a second. The future leader of the CJNG, the man who would one day carry a $10 million bounty, command a private army with rocket launchers and armored vehicles, and shoot a Mexican military helicopter out of the sky, met his future stepson when that stepson was a toddler in California. Rosalinda and El Mencho became partners, and little Juan Carlos, the boy from the Santa Ana barrio, was raised as the stepson of the man who would build the most powerful cartel in Mexico. Now, while all this was going on, the family made a decision that would change everything. They relocated from California down to Mexico. And this wasn't just a family moving back home. This was a strategic consolidation. Back in Mexico, the family became directly tied to the growth and consolidation of the trafficking organization that El Mencho was helping build. The Gonzalez Valencia clan's financial networks, the Valencia Cornelio trafficking legacy, and El Mencho's ruthless operational ambition, all of it converging under one roof. And in the middle of it all, a kid with an American birth certificate, growing up watching his stepfather climb the ranks of the underworld, absorbing lessons that no school in Orange County could ever teach. Here's where things get interesting, though, because unlike a lot of narco heirs, Juan Carlos didn't immediately vanish into the mountains of Jalisco. He kept a foot in the United States. He lived in America, the country of his birth, well into his 20s. And this dual existence, this ability to move between both worlds, between the American suburb and the Mexican Sierra, would become one of his defining characteristics. He wasn't a Mexican trafficker trying to understand the American market. He was the American market. He grew up inside it. He understood the language, the culture, the streets, the demand. And that knowledge would prove far more valuable than any inheritance. Picture the contrast for a moment, because it's genuinely surreal. In the Santa Ana barrio where he spent his early years, life looked like any working-class Southern California neighborhood. Taco trucks, lowriders, quinceañeras, kids playing in the street while their parents worked double shifts. Orange County in the 80s and 90s was a place of extremes, some of the wealthiest zip codes in America sitting minutes away from immigrant neighborhoods, where families like his scraped by on field wages. And somewhere in that ordinary American landscape walked a kid whose family gatherings included people connected to billions of dollars in trafficking revenue. His classmates' fathers were mechanics and landscapers. His family tree included a cartel founder and the architects of an international laundering empire. Nobody around him knew. That's the thing about this story that gets me every time. For years, one of the most consequential figures in the future of the drug war was just another face in an American crowd. But every double life has an expiration date. And for Juan Carlos Valencia Gonzalez, that date came in 2007. In 2007, the Federal District Court in Washington, D.C. handed down an indictment with his name on it. And this wasn't some minor possession charge. The United States government accused him of drug distribution and firearms offenses. Specifically, trafficking more than 5 kilograms of cocaine as well as methamphetamine into the United States from Mexico. Now, 5 kilograms might not sound like an earth-shattering number compared to the multi-ton seizures you hear about on the news. But understand how federal indictments work. That 5-kilogram threshold isn't the total amount they think you moved. It's the legal trigger that unlocks the most severe federal sentencing guidelines. It's the government's way of saying, we're not playing with you. We're coming for decades of your life. And what did Juan Carlos do when the indictment dropped? Did he lawyer up? Did he negotiate? Did he try to fight it in court like an American citizen exercising his rights? Nah, he did what generations of his family had done before him. He vanished. He slipped across the border into Mexico and disappeared into the protection of the family empire. And from 2007 onward, the boy from Santa Ana ceased to exist in any public sense. The United States lost track of him almost entirely. To American law enforcement, he became a ghost, a name in a case file, a fugitive somewhere south of the border. But here's the part that might actually interest you. Because while America forgot about Juan Carlos Valencia Gonzalez, Juan Carlos was not sitting idle, not even close. The years between 2007 and 2020, those 13 years of silence, are the years that transformed him from a fugitive narco heir into something Mexico had rarely seen before. A genuine military architect. You see, this is where El Pelón separated himself from every other cartel prince in Mexico. And to appreciate that, you need to understand what cartel heirs usually look like. Think about Los Chapitos, El Chapo's sons, flashing designer clothes, exotic pets, gold-plated pistols on social media. Think about the sons of old-school capos crashing Lamborghinis and posting their lifestyles online, practically begging the DEA to build cases against them. The stereotype of the narco junior is a spoiled prince coasting on daddy's name, more interested in Instagram clout than in the actual machinery of organized crime. El Pelón went the complete opposite direction. No social media, no flashy cars in public, no music commissioned in his honor blasting from every speaker in Jalisco. Instead, according to reports from Mexico's defense ministry and U.S. intelligence assessments, he buried himself in the least glamorous, most consequential part of the entire operation: warfare. He became the strategist behind the CJNG's military expansion, the mind credited with designing the specialized units that would allow the cartel to fight and win wars on multiple fronts, simultaneously. Now, to put into context just how significant this was, you have to understand the moment the CJNG was living through. This was a cartel in expansion mode, pushing into territories controlled by the Sinaloa cartel, clashing with La Familia Michoacana, fighting for states like Guanajuato, Michoacán, and Zacatecas, some of the most contested and blood-soaked real estate in the entire country. And you don't win those wars with street-level gunmen and stolen pickup trucks. You win them with organization, training, and firepower. That was El Pelón's lane. He's credited with creating specialized Sicario units, most notably Grupo Delta and the now infamous Grupo Elite. And I want you to really absorb what these units represented, because this wasn't just a rebranding of ordinary hitmen. Grupo Elite, founded in 2019, was built like a private military company. We're talking specialized military training regiments, insurgency and urban combat tactics, improvised explosive devices, yes, IEDs, the same category of weapon that defined the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan now deployed in the Mexican countryside. And perhaps most tellingly, former Colombian soldiers brought in as instructors, men who had spent their careers fighting FARC guerrillas in the jungles of Colombia, now teaching their craft to cartel recruits in Mexico. That is not a gang. That is an insurgent army with a payroll. Under El Pelón's command, Grupo Elite operated across Michoacán, Guanajuato, and Zacatecas, 3 states that, not coincidentally, became synonymous with some of the most extreme cartel violence Mexico has ever recorded. In Guanajuato, they went to war with the Santa Rosa de Lima cartel, a local organization built around fuel theft that decided to resist the CJNG's expansion. That war turned Guanajuato, a state once known for its colonial architecture and tourism, into one of the murder capitals of Mexico. In Michoacán, Grupo Elite battled Los Viagras and the constellation of local self-defense groups and rival factions fighting for control of the region. Town by town, road by road, El Pelón's units contested territory with heavy weaponry, armored vehicles, and tactics pulled straight from military doctrine. To put into context just how brutal these campaigns were, consider what happened to Guanajuato specifically. Before the CJNG's push into the state, it wasn't even on most people's radar as a cartel battleground. Within a few short years of the war against the Santa Rosa de Lima cartel, Guanajuato was regularly recording thousands of homicides annually, consistently ranking among the deadliest states in all of Mexico. Gas stations, highways, entire municipalities became front lines. Police forces were targeted, systematically, and driving that transformation was a simple strategic reality. The CJNG's forces were better trained, better armed, and better organized than anything the local organizations could field. That advantage didn't materialize out of thin air. Someone designed it. Someone recruited the instructors, structured the units, sourced the armored vehicles, and drilled the doctrine into thousands of recruits. And if you take the time and do your homework on this period, a pattern emerges. Wherever the CJNG's expansion was most aggressive, most disciplined, most militarily sophisticated, the fingerprints of El Pelón's units were there. While El Mencho was the face of the cartel, the name on the wanted posters, the voice of command, his American stepson was quietly functioning as something like his Minister of Defense, designing the machine, sharpening the blade, building the army that made the CJNG's empire physically possible. But ironically, for all the wars and all the battles, the operation that truly made El Pelón a legend in the underworld wasn't a battle at all. It was a kidnapping. And not just any kidnapping. Arguably the single most audacious move in modern cartel history. Now listen closely, because what I'm going to say next brings everything together. The year was 2016, Puerto Vallarta, Jalisco, a glittering beach resort city on the Pacific coast, packed with tourists, restaurants, and nightlife. In the early morning hours at an upscale restaurant in the city, a group of young men were celebrating. Among them were 2 individuals whose names carry more weight than almost any others in the narco world. Ivan Archivaldo Guzman and Jesus Alfredo Guzman, the princes of the Sinaloa cartel. And into that restaurant walked armed men, operators attributed to the Grupo Elite structure under El Pelón's leadership, who took El Chapo's sons hostage at gunpoint and disappeared into the night with them. I need you to sit with the magnitude of that for a second. In 2016, El Chapo Guzman was the most famous criminal on planet Earth. His cartel, Sinaloa, was the largest and most established trafficking organization in the hemisphere, with alliances, corrupt officials, and gunmen spread across the entire country. Kidnapping his sons wasn't just an act of war. It was the underworld equivalent of walking into the lion's den, slapping the lion, and taking its cubs. Everyone in Mexico understood what the standard consequence for that move looked like. Total annihilation. Not just for the man who ordered it, but for his family, his associates, anyone who ever shook his hand. Reports from that night describe a surgical operation. The gunmen knew exactly who they were looking for, exactly where the party was, and exactly how to extract their targets from a crowded restaurant in a tourist city without triggering a massacre. Several members of the group were taken. The message being sent required precision, not carnage. And within hours, the news detonated across Mexico and the United States. The DEA scrambled. The Mexican government scrambled. Because everybody, from Culiacan to Washington, understood that if El Chapo's sons died in CJNG custody, Mexico wasn't looking at another turf war. It was looking at something closer to a nationwide conflagration between the two most powerful criminal armies on the continent. So why did El Pelón do it, you ask? Well, it all boils down to the bigger chess game. The CJNG and Sinaloa were locked in a struggle for supremacy, for roots, for territory, for the future of the entire drug trade. And El Chapo himself was at his most vulnerable point in decades. He had been recaptured by Mexican authorities in January of 2016, after his infamous tunnel escape, and he was sitting in a maximum security prison fighting extradition to the United States. The king was in a cage. His empire was wobbling, and the CJNG saw an opening to demonstrate, in the most humiliating way imaginable, that the Sinaloa cartel could no longer protect even its own royal family. Snatching the heirs off the streets of a resort town in CJNG territory was a message written in the boldest possible ink. Your era is ending, ours is beginning. But did the CJNG execute the sons? Did this ignite the apocalyptic total war everyone braced for? Well, no. And this is where the story takes its most surreal turn. From inside prison, El Chapo Guzman himself intervened. Word came down through lawyers and intermediaries, and reportedly through direct threats channeled from the imprisoned kingpin, making it clear that if his sons were harmed, the response would be a war without limits, without rules, and without end. Negotiations happened in the shadows, and after several days in captivity, Ivan Archivaldo and Jesus Alfredo Guzman were released, alive, unharmed, walking free. Now, some might frame that release as El Pelón backing down. But understand what the underworld actually took away from this episode. A man kidnapped the sons of the most powerful drug lord alive, held them long enough to prove he could, extracted whatever concessions were made in those shadow negotiations, released them on his own terms, and then continued living. No retaliatory hit ever got him. No Sinaloa vengeance ever reached him. In a world where men are dismembered over a disrespectful glance, El Pelón took the most disrespectful action conceivable against the most dangerous family alive, and walked away untouched. That single operation cemented his reputation permanently. In the eyes of the cartel world, he was no longer just El Mencho's stepson, or the Milenio founder's boy. He was a man who could look the devil in the eye and not blink. And yet, and here's the part that genuinely separates him from every other figure in this world, after pulling off the most famous kidnapping in cartel history, he went right back into the shadows. Think about that discipline. Most men would ride that reputation forever. He buried it. For years afterward, the general public had no idea he even existed. To this day, only one public photograph of him is known to exist. One. In an era where Los Chapitos' faces are plastered across social media and every mid-level narco commissions ballads about himself, the architect of the CJNG's war machine remained functionally invisible. No interviews. No leaked party photos. No paper trail for journalists to follow. Intelligence agencies knew a strategist existed behind the cartel's military evolution, but attaching a face and a full biography to that strategist took years. So, how did the mask finally slip? Well, ironically, it wasn't his own mistake that exposed him. It was a birthday party. In 2020, a video began circulating that stunned even hardened observers of the drug war. It was filmed as a birthday tribute to El Mencho, a rolling display of raw military power. The footage showed a caravan of 22 armored vehicles, not modified trucks with some steel plates welded on. We're talking purpose-built war machines with gun turrets, mounted machine guns, Barrett 50 caliber rifles capable of punching through engine blocks, and grenade launchers. Dozens of uniformed fighters in matching tactical gear, body armor, and helmets, looking less like cartel gunmen and more like a national army on parade. And on that video, the assembled fighters chanted three things: Señor Mencho, Puro Grupo Elite, and, pay attention to this, one, Arriba L3. Now, to a casual viewer, Arriba L3 means nothing, just a number. But to Mexican intelligence analysts, that chant was a thread, because L3, Tres, was a code name. And when the Mexican government pulled that thread, the trail led directly to the man commanding the Grupo Elite. Later in 2020, the Mexican government publicly named him for the first time, Juan Carlos Valencia Gonzalez, El Pelón. The ghost finally had a name attached to his machine. And by 2021, the United States government, the same government that had indicted him back in 2007 and then largely lost sight of him, had him squarely back in its sights, now understanding that the fugitive from that old DC drug case had evolved into one of the most dangerous military minds in the Western Hemisphere. But even after being named, he didn't change his approach. No public responses, no propaganda videos starring himself. He simply kept building, kept fighting, kept consolidating, the invisible general behind the most feared army in Mexico. And for 6 more years, that's exactly what he remained. Until February of 2026, when everything changed. According to reports of the operation, Mexican military forces closed in on a compound in Tapalpa, Jalisco, a mountainous municipality in the heart of CJNG territory. The target was the crown jewel of the entire drug war, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho himself, the man who had evaded capture for over a decade, who had shot down a military helicopter, who had transformed a splinter faction into a global empire operating on 6 continents. And in that operation in Tapalpa, El Mencho's reign came to an end. The most wanted drug lord on earth, the man with the $10 million American bounty, was gone. And the entire world held its breath. Because everyone who studies cartels knows what usually happens when a kingpin falls. Fragmentation, civil war, lieutenants turning on each other. It's the pattern we saw when the Zetas lost their leaders, when the Beltran-Leyva organization shattered, when countless other empires ate themselves alive after decapitation. Analysts openly predicted the CJNG would split into warring factions, and Mexico would burn even hotter in the chaos. But that's not what happened. Instead, within a remarkably short window, U.S. counterterrorism authorities identified the CJNG's new leader, and it was the stepson, the American, the kid from Santa Ana, Juan Carlos Valencia Gonzalez. El Pelón, at 41 years old, had inherited the entire empire. And when you trace the whole arc, you realize this wasn't luck or nepotism. This was the endgame of a 20-year strategy. While flashier heirs collected enemies and indictments, El Pelón collected soldiers and loyalty. The men with the guns, the Grupo Elite, the Grupo Delta, the armed wing that actually holds territory. Those were his men, trained under his doctrine, loyal to his command structure. When the throne opened up, there was no succession war, because there was no one left with the military power to contest him. He didn't just inherit the crown. He had spent 2 decades building the army that guaranteed the crown would come to him. And just this month, the United States made it official in the most bureaucratically brutal way possible. OFAC, the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, published an updated organizational chart at the CJNG. And sitting at the very top of that chart, in the box once occupied by El Mencho, is the name Juan Carlos Valencia Gonzalez. Alongside that designation, OFAC sanctioned over 50 individuals and companies tied to the CJNG's network, freezing assets, cutting off financial access, and dismantling pieces of the laundering infrastructure that, remember, his own mother's family pioneered through Los Queenies. The United States government now officially recognizes an American citizen as the leader of a foreign terrorist organization. There is a $5 million reward outstanding for information leading to his capture. And according to intelligence sources, he's believed to be running the entire global operation from the mountainous Los Altos region of Jalisco. Rugged highland terrain, loyal territory. The kind of ground where a man who has spent his life avoiding cameras can stay invisible for a very long time. So where does that leave us? Well, according to multiple assessments, the CJNG under El Pelón may actually be more dangerous than it was under El Mencho, not less. Few analysts predicted a smooth succession, and yet the transition appears to have been exactly that: quiet, disciplined, uncontested. Some sources point to the sanctions squeezing the cartel's finances, and the pressure is real. But even if the money is getting harder to move, the machine itself, the army, the routes, the territorial control, remains fully intact and now answers to the man who built its most lethal components with his own hands. There's also the question of what his leadership style means for the violence itself. El Mencho ruled through fear and spectacle as much as strategy. The CJNG under his reign became infamous for public displays of brutality designed to terrorize rivals and civilians alike. El Pelón's entire career suggests a different temperament. Quieter, more calculated, more institutional. Some analysts believe that could mean a cartel that behaves less like a rampaging warlord state and more like a disciplined corporation with an army, which sounds like an improvement until you realize that a smarter, quieter, more corporate cartel is significantly harder to fight, harder to infiltrate, and harder to destroy. Loud enemies make mistakes. This man has spent 20 years proving he doesn't make many. And here's something no one actually talks about. Every previous generation of cartel leadership was fundamentally Mexican in its worldview. Men from the Sierra who understood the mountains, the ranchos, the local politics. El Pelón represents something new, and frankly, something more unsettling. A leader who understands America from the inside, who grew up in its neighborhoods, speaks its language natively, and knows its consumer market not as a foreign destination, but as home. The conditions that created him can't easily be replicated. The twin bloodlines, the stepfather's empire, the American upbringing, the 2 decades of invisible military work. It's a 1 in a billion convergence. Other cartel figures could try to copy the low-profile, military-first playbook he perfected, but without his lineage and his army, they'd likely inherit only the violence and none of the empire. The only question left to answer right now is, what happens next? Because history says every kingpin falls eventually. El Chapo fell, El Mencho fell, the $5 million bounty on El Pelón's head will only grow. And somewhere in Washington, agencies are already building the file that they hope ends with him in a courtroom. Possibly the same D.C. federal court that first indicted him back in 2007, closing a circle nearly 20 years in the making. But for now, the boy from Santa Ana sits on the throne of Mexico's most powerful cartel, invisible in the mountains of Jalisco, commanding the army he spent his life building. The American kingpin's story is just beginning to be written, and something tells me the next chapter is going to be the most dramatic one yet.